The entity in the walls, the house on Millbrook Lane, had stood abandoned for years, a crumbling relic of a time long past. When the Sanders family decided to buy it, they saw only potential and opportunity to turn the dilapidated structure into their dream home. David and Maria Sanders, along with their 2 children, Ethan and Lily, moved into the house with a sense of excitement and optimism, despite its eerie reputation among the locals. "That place is cursed," the old woman at the hardware store had warned, but David dismissed her words as nothing more than small-town superstition. After all, they had gotten the house for a steal, and with some hard work, it would be the perfect place for their growing family. At first, things seemed to be going well. The renovations were slow but steady, and the house began to take on new life. The kids loved exploring the large, sprawling property, playing hide and seek in the vast rooms. But as the days turned into weeks, a sense of unease began to settle over the family. It started with small things, faint sounds in the walls, like the scurrying of rats. At first, David shrugged it off, blaming the old structure's creaks and groans. But then the noises became more distinct. Footsteps, whispering. And late at night, when the house was still and the darkness pressed in, it felt as if someone or something was watching. The first signs one night, while lying in bed, Maria heard a strange sound coming from the walls. It wasn't the usual creak of settling wood. It was rhythmic, deliberate, almost like breathing. She nudged David awake. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice tinged with fear. David listened for a moment, then shook his head. "It's just the house, Maria. Old places like this always make noise. Don't worry." But Maria couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. The sound felt alive, like something lurking just out of sight. Over the next few days, she continued to hear it, always at night, always coming from the walls. Meanwhile, strange things began happening around the houses. Objects would move on their own keys, left on the kitchen counter, would appear in the living room. Doors that were closed would suddenly be open. The children, once carefree and playful, became withdrawn, complaining of bad dreams and shadows in their rooms. Lily, the youngest, started talking to someone who wasn't there. When Maria asked her who she was speaking to, Lily simply said, "The man in the walls." Maria's heart skipped a beat. "What man, sweetie?" "The man who watches us. He lives in the walls, Mommy. He says he's lonely." Maria tried to laugh it off, telling herself it was just a figment of Lily's imagination, but deep down, she felt an icy chill. The descent, as the weeks went on, the occurrences became harder to ignore. One evening, while working in his home office, David heard a soft scratching sound. He paused, listening. It seemed to be coming from the wall behind his desk. Frowning, he leaned closer, pressing his ear to the wall. That's when he heard it, faint but unmistakable. A voice, whispering his name. David jumped back, his heart racing. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, but the voice had been so clear, so deliberate. It wasn't the house settling. It was something or someone trying to communicate. That night, David had a nightmare. He was trapped in the walls of the house, his limbs bound by the wooden beams, unable to move. He could hear his family calling for him, but every time he tried to answer, his voice was muffled, as if the walls were swallowing his words. When he woke up, drenched in sweat, he found Maria sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with fear. "I heard it again," she whispered. "The breathing. It's getting closer." From that moment on, the house no longer felt like home. It felt like a prison, a living, breathing entity that surrounded them, watching their every move. Ethan's discovery one afternoon, while playing in the basement, Ethan found something unusual. Behind an old bookshelf, there was a small door, almost hidden in the shadows. Curious, he opened it and found a narrow passage leading into the walls of the house. The air inside was cold and damp, and the smell of mold was overpowering. Ethan called out for his parents, but as he turned to leave, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure, barely visible in the dim light, standing at the end of the passage. He screamed and ran upstairs, trembling with fear. When David and Maria arrived, they found the passage empty, but the door to the hidden space was wide open. "There's something in there," Ethan cried. "I saw it." David tried to reassure him, but the boy's terror was undeniable. That night, the strange noises in the walls grew louder, more aggressive. It was as if whatever had been lurking there was no longer content to remain hidden. The haunting escalates in the days that followed. The family began to unravel. Maria barely slept, her nights filled with terrifying visions of shadowy figures creeping through the house. David became obsessed with the walls, tearing down sections of drywall in a desperate attempt to find the source of the disturbances. But no matter how much he destroyed, the sounds persisted. Lily's behavior grew more erratic. She stopped speaking altogether, retreating into herself. When Maria tried to comfort her, Lily would simply stare at the walls, her eyes vacant, as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. Then one evening, Maria found a series of crude drawings in Lily's room. They depicted a family, her family, but there was always a dark figure standing behind them, lurking just out of sight. In each drawing, the figure grew larger, more distinct, until in the final picture, it stood directly over them, its shadowy arms reaching out. The final night, it all came to a head one stormy night. The rain pounded against the windows, and the wind howled through the cracks in the old house. David had barricaded himself in the basement, convinced that he could destroy whatever was hiding within the walls. Upstairs, Maria sat with the children, trying to keep them calm, though her own fear was palpable. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind sent her heart racing, but it was the sound of footsteps in the walls that terrified her the most. They were no longer faint. They were deliberate, slow, and getting closer. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. Maria grabbed a flashlight and hurried to check on David, but when she reached the basement, she found him lying on the floor, unconscious, with a deep gash on his forehead. Panicking, she tried to wake him, but then she heard a low, guttural growl echoing from the walls. It was followed by a chilling whisper, "Get out!" Maria grabbed the children and ran for the door, but it slammed shut in front of her, as if the house itself was sealing them in. The walls began to tremble, and the sound of scratching grew louder, more frantic. Ethan screamed as a shadowy figure emerged from the wall, its twisted form barely human. It reached out toward them, its eyes glowing with malice. Maria tried to shield the children, but the entity was relentless, its presence overwhelming. Just as it seemed like they were about to be consumed by the darkness, David staggered up the stairs, blood dripping from his head. With the last of his strength, he swung a sledgehammer into the wall, shattering it. The entity let out a bone-chilling scream and disappeared, leaving behind only the echo of its malevolent presence. The aftermath: the Sanders family fled the house that night, leaving behind everything they owned. They never spoke of what happened, and the house on Millbrook Lane was abandoned once again, left to decay. But the locals still whisper about the Sanders family and the horrors they endured. Some say the entity was an ancient evil, awakened by the family's arrival. Others believe it was the restless spirit of a former resident, trapped within the walls, waiting for the right moment to strike. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain: the house on Millbrook Lane is not just a house. It is something far more sinister, something that still waits in the walls for its next victims.